You've probably seen the headline that the Supreme Court just shut down Donald Trump's tariffs, and that might sound like boring government news, but what actually happened affects prices, inflation, global trade, and how quietly money has been pulled out of your pocket without most people ever realizing it. What you should know about tariffs is that they're not just trade policy or political leverage, they're a hidden tax mechanism that shapes how much you pay for everyday goods, how companies price products, and how inflation can rise without anyone ever voting for it. At their core, tariffs are simple but dangerous, because they're taxes charged at the border when companies import goods into the United States, meaning the US government bills the importer directly, not the foreign country, not the overseas factory, and not some abstract global entity. That detail matters more than people think. Because companies don't absorb taxes out of goodwill, they protect margins and survival, which means the cost of a tariff almost always gets passed forward into prices, quietly turning trade policy into something you feel every time you buy groceries, electronics, cars, appliances, or basic household items. This is why tariffs are often described as inflationary, even though they're rarely labeled that way. Because instead of prices rising due to demand or money printing, prices rise because costs were deliberately injected into the system upstream, and by the time that cost reaches consumers, the original cause is almost invisible. But tariffs don't just raise prices in the moment, they change behavior. Because once companies face higher costs, they restructure supply chains, renegotiate contracts, shift production, and redesign entire pricing models to survive in the new environment. That creates what economists call price stickiness, where prices stay elevated even after the original pressure is removed. Because once a system adapts to higher costs, there's very little incentive to voluntarily unwind those changes unless competition forces it. This is why people are often confused when tariffs are removed and prices don't fall, because the economy doesn't work like a light switch. It works like concrete that slowly sets, and once it hardens, reversing it takes time, pressure, and pain. Now this is where the Supreme Court ruling comes in, because the decision wasn't about whether tariffs are good or bad policy. It was about who has the authority to impose them in the first place. Under the Constitution, the power to tax belongs to Congress, not the President, and in this case the tariffs were imposed using emergency powers meant for extraordinary threats, which the court ruled does not grant the executive branch the authority to impose sweeping taxes on imports. That legal distinction may sound technical, but it matters deeply because once emergency powers are used to reshape the economy, it becomes dangerously easy for massive financial decisions to bypass debate, oversight, and accountability. As a result of this ruling, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariff revenue now sit in legal uncertainty, with companies potentially seeking refunds, trade rules being reconsidered, and future administrations facing tighter limits on how quickly they can deploy trade barriers. But even here, the story doesn't resolve cleanly, because while importers may fight to recover that money, consumers are unlikely to ever see refunds for the higher prices they already paid, since those costs were quietly absorbed, normalized, and spent long ago. And this is where the real tension begins, because tariffs don't just take money, they change expectations, behavior, and trust in ways that don't show up immediately, but compound over time. And this is where tariffs become more than an economic tool, because once expectations change, people adjust their lives around higher prices, tighter budgets, and reduced flexibility, which quietly reshapes behavior in ways that are hard to reverse. When prices rise and stay high, households don't just complain, they adapt, spending less, saving less, taking on more debt, and delaying decisions like buying homes, starting businesses, or having children, all while feeling like they're falling behind despite working just as hard. That pressure compounds over time because even small persistent increases in costs can erode financial stability, especially for people living paycheck to paycheck, turning what looks like a policy choice into a long-term drag on economic confidence. From the business side, tariffs also change how risk is calculated, because when trade rules can shift suddenly, companies are forced to plan for uncertainty, building redundancy, inefficiency, and extra cost into systems that were once optimized for speed and affordability. Those inefficiencies don't disappear when tariffs are lifted, they become permanent features of the economy, raising baseline costs and reducing resilience when real crises occur, which makes future shocks more painful than they otherwise would have been. This is why economists often describe tariffs as friction, because each one adds resistance to the system, slowing growth, reducing competition, and making everything just a little harder to move, even if no single tariff feels catastrophic on its own. There's also psychological effect that rarely gets discussed, because when people can't clearly see why prices are rising, trust erodes, frustration builds, and institutions start to feel distant or unresponsive, even when the cause is rooted in policy rather than market failure. That erosion of trust matters, because economies don't run on numbers alone, they run on expectations, and when people expect instability, they behave defensively, which slows growth and reinforces the very problems they're trying to protect themselves from. On a global scale, tariffs weaken cooperation, because trade relationships aren't just economic, they're strategic, and when countries retaliate or pull back, coordination on technology, energy, and security becomes harder, increasing long-term risk. This global uncertainty feeds back into domestic markets because businesses hesitate to invest, supply chains fragment, and innovation slows, not because ideas disappear, but because confidence does. And once innovation slows, the real cost of tariffs becomes clearer, because the damage isn't just what you pay today, it's the efficiency gains that never happened, the products that never got cheaper, and the opportunities that quietly vanished. This is why removing tariffs often feels anticlimactic, because the legal framework may change overnight, but the economic scars remain embedded in systems, habits, and expectations that took years to form. Prices don't rush downward, behavior doesn't instantly reset, and trust takes time to rebuild, which can leave people feeling like nothing changed, even when something important did. That disconnect can breed cynicism, making policy feel pointless or performative, when in reality the consequences are very real, just delayed and unevenly distributed. The deeper lesson in all of this is not that tariffs are always wrong or always right, but that they are powerful, blunt tools, capable of reshaping economies in ways that are hard to see while they're happening, and even harder to undo once they've taken hold. They may be framed as protection or leverage, but at their core, tariffs are taxes that move quietly through the system, altering prices, behavior, and trust long after the headlines fade. And once you understand that, it becomes clear why decisions about tariffs matter so much. Not just for trade or politics, but for the everyday reality people experience, without always knowing why it feels more expensive, more fragile, and more uncertain than it used to. That's the real impact of tariffs, not in theory, but in how they slowly reshape the world people live in. And that's the breakdown. If you learned something new, leave a like and subscribe, but more importantly, drop a comment with what we should break down next, since these videos are driven by your requests. And until next time, stay curious and keep learning.